Olá, eu sou Malu Mões e este é mais um Poder Entrevista. Nosso entrevistado de hoje é Willam Maloney. Ele é economista-chefe para a América Latina e Caribe do Banco Mundial. A entrevista será conduzida em inglês, mas estará legendada. Hi, Mr. Maloney, we are really glad to have you here today.
Muito prazer. Thank you for the invitation.
How do you see the performance of Latin America countries in containing the impacts of the pandemic in the economy?
I think there's a lot of heterogeneity both across the world and within Latin America. The region as a whole was hit harder than most other regions. And that's probably some combination of the shock to commodity prices and just the internal lockdowns that were orchestrated early on. Some countries were much more aggressive in trying to buffer the shock. We, for instance, run something called the Pulse Survey in the World Bank that talks to roughly, some 5,000 firms in each country. And you find, for instance, that in Mexico, about 9% of firms said that they received some sort of government support during the crisis. Brazil, it's more like 30. And Vietnam's like 20, and Poland's like 60. So there's a wide range across the world in how people supported firms, and also how people supported families. And so Brazil suffered a little bit less in terms of the fall in GDP than other regions of Latin America, perhaps partly because of these interventions, although obviously at the cost of some fiscal stress. So looking forward, though, the question is, and we've seen upgrading of the forecasts going forward in a lot of the countries, and that's good news. But I think the long-term things on our mind are, well, in the short term, the question is, how much is the delta going to set us back, or the gamma after that? All of Latin America has made surprising advances in vaccination compared to where we were several months ago. And I think Brazil's at 50%, and that's really good, and that's a good sign. We just have to hope that keeps going and hope it's effective against the next couple rounds. And in the long term, of course, and we'll get to this later, it's what damage was done to our economies and to our populations during the crisis that may affect growth, which even before the crisis was low in Latin America.
What are the economic concerns about Latin America now that the world economy is recovering?
So just things that I'm watching within Latin America, which I think people are watching around the world, but we have to be careful of, is, for instance, what happened to the firm sector. I haven't been to Sao Paulo or Rio recently, but in Washington, D.C., as you walk around, you see stores that have disappeared, right? And among firms that we still see functioning, a lot of them took on a lot of debt or didn't pay their debts for a while. For instance, in Mexico, I have the Pulse survey shows that roughly, as of March, roughly 50% of firms had delayed a payment on their debt, and 32 were expecting to delay more payments. So what that means is there are a lot of firms that are accumulating a lot of debt. And on the one hand, that means that, and I think that's true across the world and across Latin America in particular, and perhaps Brazil's more aggressive policies towards the firm sector have mitigated that some. But what we're going to be leaving the crisis with firms with more debt, and we're going to leave the crisis with banking sectors where we're less clear which debts are really good and are going to be able to be paid and which aren't. And that loss in transparency to the financial sector, again, this is across the world, is something we have to pay attention to, and just how firms recover in terms of investment, in terms of trying to expand. Those are things we really need to watch leaving the crisis.
And in this scenario, what can we do to have a better recovery?
I think I should have also mentioned just in that on on the workforce side, on the human capital side, across the region, closing schools, which wasn't done everywhere in the world, really set us back probably a year in terms of studies, and for the poorer sectors of the economy even more, who are less connected even more. So that's also going to be a drag going forward, the loss in human capital. And I think it's very good that we're going back to school. The things we have to do on the firm sector, we just have to really improve our mechanisms for resolving stressed firms, resolving indebtedness. In the region in general, our bankruptcy laws are pretty heavy and not nimble. And I know most countries, including Brazil, have been working towards making that more nimble. And that's going to be important to getting firms either getting back up on their feet or saying, no, it's over. And just on the banking side, we have to move fairly in a parallel process to be sure that we're regaining transparency, so we know what's happening there. The deeper problem that we have to look at squarely is that even before the crisis, Latin America was not growing well, and that includes Brazil. Brazil was doing decently well at the beginning of the 2010s, but by the end of them, it had been a pretty unimpressive decade. And that's how it was for all of Latin America, which grew at about 2.2% roughly across that decade, while the rest of the world is growing at something like 3.5. Okay, so the big questions we have to be thinking about in the long term are why that is, and then in this process of getting out of COVID and in reorganizing our budgets and in thinking through the firm sector and the kinds of programs we have for support, are we setting ourselves up for better growth going forward? I think that is, we want to hold both those things in our head. Why were we not doing better before? Why did we have another lost decade, if you will? And then how can we, in effect, use this crisis to prepare ourselves better for the next decade?
Has inequality between Latin America and other parts of the world, such as Europe or United States, increased during the pandemic?
So that remains to be seen, because the negative shock that Latin America got was worse than most parts of the world last year. On the other hand, the recovery is going a little bit better than we expected at the beginning of this year. So that the net effect of the crisis is not going to be clear on the growth rates over the last 2 years. I mean, compared to, of course, China and India, which had much faster growth rates, which drive those regions, probably we're not going to be growing as fast, and that will increase inequality. And when we look back over the whole decade, and I think it is important to do that, keep in mind that Latin America grew roughly 2.2%, while the world grew somewhere around 3.5%. So necessarily the inequality between Latin America and the rest of the world increased. In general, growth needs to be central on the agenda of Latin America, leaving the crisis, looking forward. I mean, Latin America right now is growing over the last year is growing quite well relative to the rest of the world. However, it fell a lot more before than most other regions. And I mean, so right now for Latin America, I think we're thinking 5.8% growth, and that's reasonably good, except that we fell almost the same amount beforehand, and the subsequent years are in the twos, right? So it's like 2.5 and then 2.3, I think, is what the Global Economic Prospects report that we put out in June had. These are all now old forecasts, but the bottom line is we're rebounding from a big hit, but we're not forecasting that to sustain over time. Asia has been, China. When we talk Asia, we're really talking China. When we're talking South Asia, we're really talking India. Those countries are, talking 8.5 and 8.3% growth, and that's obviously doing better than LAC. But yes, but in general, this year has been better than the rest of the world, but coming from a much lower base.
What can we do to contain this increase of the inequality?
So obviously Brazil has experimented with a lot of important social programs, like Bolsa Familia and things like that, which have have important impacts on inequality within the country. I would say that within the country, this is what we're talking about, right? Within the country, we have to ensure that the shocks to the lower quintiles of the population are not exacerbated. Again, we lost a lot of schooling last year across the region, but most of it is concentrated in the bottom 2 quintiles, where kids couldn't go to school and don't have access to electronic media for the most part. And when we talk about losing a year or 2 of schooling for those populations, it really decreases their earnings and it really exacerbates inequality. And this is a problem across the region. And so the fact that we're going back to school is very, very important for mitigating inequality. Again, in the big picture, growing 2.2% or 2% as a region is a really hard way to lower inequality, to lower poverty. We'd like to get much faster growth rates to make progress on that.
How would you describe Brazil's performance during the pandemic?
Well, again, as I said before, it fell. GDP fell less than some other countries in the region, and it's recovering fairly well at this point. I mean, I think we were forecasting 4.5% growth in June in the global economic prospects. If you look at the consensus forecasts, which are not World Bank forecasts, but they're just the global consensus forecast, I think they moved that up to 4.9 or something like that. So that's looking good. So Brazil was hit a little bit less, and it's recovering a bit more robustly. And some of the things that were worrisome, for instance, the big buildup in debt. The fiscal situation, I don't want to get too deeply into these things, but the fiscal situation is looking a little bit more positive than it did several months ago.
What is the importance of Brazil investing on environmental sustainability?
So, obviously, Brazil is a special country in terms of the role it plays in the global environment, right? If you look at Latin America as a whole, we emit fairly little in terms of global carbon emissions. It's somewhere 5-7%, depending on who you're talking to. So, it's sometimes hard for finance ministers to get really enthusiastic when you say, well, yeah, we were growing 2.2% in the 2010s, and now you're saying we should slow down to mitigate the environment. So, but Brazil is a special case because of the special role that the Amazon plays, right? And it is such a large player in terms of global warming that it gets a lot of attention internationally. Brazil has an interest also in making sure that it continues to do the healthy work of the lungs of the world at some level, while not limiting Brazil's growth prospects. But yeah, it's going to get more attention over time, and you want to be ahead of the curve and thinking about how Brazil is managing the Amazon.
Thanks, Mr. Maloney. We have been really glad to have you here today.
Great. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk with you. It's been fun.
Eu sou Malu Mões e este foi mais um Poder Entrevista. Se inscreva no canal e ative as notificações para saber sempre que um novo vídeo for ao ar. Até!